Thank you very much for these very enlightening presentations. It really is a very desperate situation, it would seem, in the Mediterranean, where, as I understand it, 95% of the species are threatened, and in order to put this right, the fishing effort's got to be halved. That's what I take from the presentations we've had. And, of course, understanding the problem, okay, that's taking us halfway, but as you've said in the presentations, implementation and enforcement, of course, is the rest of it, and is that likely to happen? And if you look at the situation, it isn't really very good. Only two things can happen here. Either the Mediterranean gets fished out, or half the fishing vessels there will simply have to stay in dock forever. And that is going to take some enforcing. And I wonder what the Commission's plans are to enforce the enforcement. But of course, the Mediterranean is a lake, really, isn't it? There's small access to the Atlantic, but it's a very homogeneous area. And it isn't all controlled or fished by EU fishing fleets. There's all the North African fleet. And I wonder, that hasn't been mentioned, the North African fishing fleet effort. Could you just give an indication as to whether they are overfishing their half? And even if all 7 EU countries that fish at on the northern shores, if they all behave themselves, will that be completely nullified by the fishing effort from the North African countries? Thank you.
But as said before, and as rightly said by a number of you, the Mediterranean is a lake, as you said. So it's, even if the EU member state would respect the regulation, the legislation, we wouldn't have completely addressed the situation of the stocks. That's why we have also started, at the same period, in the last 3 years, a big overhaul of the GFCM, of the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean, because nothing can happen in the Mediterranean if we don't have all the countries on board, and not only the African countries. It's also Turkey, it's also the eastern part of the Mediterranean countries. And unfortunately, we cannot impose measures, but again, with this overhaul of GFCM, which has been driven largely by the EU, we are the main partners, we have a relative open support from Turkey also. We have managed last year for the first time to have a management plan, a GFCM management plan for the Adriatic, for small pelagics, which are one of the species that are the most endangered. So that's already a step forward. I accept that there is a lot to do, and we are only at the beginning of a process. I recognise that this process should have started earlier, but this is where we are today. We will need to monitor that, and as said by Mr. Romeva, we need to implement the CFP reform in the Mediterranean. So to answer what Mrs. Fraga was also asking, we will have to implement the landing obligation, to implement MSY in the Mediterranean like in other areas of the EU. This means that this will be done as of next year.
So if not, we'll move on to the... Yes, sorry, Mr. Agnew, please.
Well, I know some of the MPs in here will say, well, Agnew would say that, wouldn't he? But listening to what the Commissioner just said, they're hoping for some money. And, of course, this is money to try and retrieve the situation, the disastrous situation in the Mediterranean. And who is going to supply that money but the British taxpayer, who has nothing to do with the Mediterranean whatsoever? Well, at least you're laughing. Thank you very much.
Gracias, señor Agnew.
Thank you, Mr. Agnew. Thank heavens for the British taxpayer is all I can say. We need them. Right, let's move on to the second part of the second block.